The night air over the training compound was thick with humidity, carrying the smell of wet earth and cordite from the spent rounds of earlier exercises. Floodlights ringed the perimeter of the SEAL training grounds, casting long shadows across the gravel where recruits and operators alike gathered for the nightly briefing. The mission board was lit by a single portable lamp, and around it stood men built like statues, each one confident in his strength, his reputation, and his right to be there. At the edge of the group, just outside the tight circle of hardened warriors, stood Sarah Hale. She wasn't a SEAL, not officially, and by their measure, not even supposed to be standing this close. Her background wasn't born of the Navy pipeline or forged in the crucible of BUD/S, but rather through years of self-imposed trials, combat rescue, paramedicine in hostile environments, private security operations in places polite society never dared to think about. Still, none of that seemed to matter to the officer who had already dismissed her before she could even step forward. "No one can hit that," he had scoffed earlier, his voice dripping with arrogance as he pointed toward the map of the raid simulation. "Not in total darkness, not without NVGs, and sure as hell not her." The laughter that followed from a few of the men was low and cruel, the kind reserved for outsiders who dared to step on sacred ground. Sarah had kept her chin high, eyes locked on the officer, not offering him the satisfaction of flinching. She had been brought in by an old friend, a master chief who had vouched for her skill, her precision, and her grit, but respect in this world wasn't handed out. It was bled for, earned in the crucible of action. And tonight, the crucible was a night raid simulation designed to replicate the chaos of a real strike on an insurgent compound. The parameters were brutal. Total blackout conditions, no lights, no NVGs, no thermal imaging, just instinct, training, and the ability to read the world in sound, silhouette, and breath. 15 targets hidden across the mock compound, each one armed, each one positioned to ambush, each one waiting to exploit the smallest mistake. The SEAL officer had already written her off, and the men around him had followed his lead, but Sarah had no intention of walking away. The Master Chief gave her a quiet nod from across the gravel, a signal not of pity but of permission. He wasn't going to fight her battles with words. If she wanted to prove herself, it had to be through the kind of action that left no room for doubt. When the signal horn blared, the compound went dark, swallowed by silence except for the rustle of gear and the sound of boots hitting dirt. The men surged forward in teams, each moving with the practiced coordination of those who had trained together for years. Sarah, alone, slipped into the shadows. Her breathing slowed, her steps softened to a whisper, and in that instant the night became her ally. Where others saw blindness, she saw possibility. The first target was crouched behind a low wall, the click of his weapon's safety barely audible over the insect hum of the humid night. Sarah moved low, sliding along the wall's edge, timing her advance with the shift of the breeze and the rustle of leaves. The strike was swift, silent. An arm looped around the man's throat, the press of her blade just enough to count him as neutralized in the simulation. She eased him down, already scanning for the next. A gunshot cracked somewhere to the left. A team had been spotted, their cover blown. Shouts erupted, boots pounded, the simulation alive with the chaos of a raid gone loud. Sarah didn't move toward the noise. She trusted the teams to handle their fight. Her focus was the target still lurking in silence. She ghosted through the alleys of the mock compound, each corner approached with discipline, every step calculated. The second target went down with a chokehold, the third with a swift takedown that ended in silence. Each time, she melted back into the night before anyone could register her presence. By the time she reached the central building, the tally in her mind had climbed to 6. Sweat rolled down her neck, soaking the collar of her shirt, but her hands were steady, her breath controlled. The darkness pressed in around her, but her senses had sharpened into something almost preternatural. Every scrape, every exhale, every shift of fabric against skin painted the battlefield in her mind. At the threshold of the main doorway, she heard the officer's voice bark an order in the distance. He was pushing his men hard, urging them to clear fast and prove the outsider irrelevant. Sarah allowed herself the briefest flicker of a smile. Let him think her irrelevant. The tally would speak louder than any insult. She slipped inside, where 3 more targets waited, their positions betrayed by the rhythm of their shifting weight. The fight was harder here, closer quarters, but she adapted, flowing from strike to strike, her movements efficient and brutal. By the time she slipped out the rear door, her count had climbed to 9. The compound erupted then, a storm of gunfire, shouts, and simulated detonations. The teams were struggling, some pinned down, others scrambling to recover from ambushes. In that storm, Sarah thrived. She didn't move like a soldier bound to a unit. She moved like a shadow, slipping in where the chaos was thickest, neutralizing targets with surgical precision before dissolving back into invisibility. When the final horn sounded to signal the end of the exercise, the men staggered into the open ground, sweat-drenched and breathing hard. The officer strode forward, his face set in a scowl, ready to declare victory for his teams and dismiss her effort entirely. But the Master Chief stepped forward first, clipboard in hand, tally marks recorded in neat columns. One by one he read the numbers, each operator's count of targets taken down. The totals were respectable, some even impressive. Then came Sarah's number, 15. The entire board. Silence fell over the gravel yard, heavy and absolute. The officer's mouth tightened, his earlier words hanging in the air like poison he'd now been forced to drink. No one can hit that, he had said. But she had. In total darkness. Alone. The silence that followed the announcement was heavier than the night itself, stretching long enough for Sarah to hear the faint drip of sweat sliding down her temple and hitting the gravel beneath her boots. She didn't look at the officer, didn't need to. His scowl was sharp enough to cut steel, but she wasn't here for his approval. She was here because doubt had followed her like a shadow her entire life, and tonight she'd broken it clean in half. The other operators shifted uneasily, a few stealing glances at her, as if struggling to reconcile what they had just heard with what they thought they knew. It was supposed to be impossible. No NVGs, no spotters, 15 targets hidden across the compound, and she had erased them all like a ghost in the night. The Master Chief didn't smile as he handed the clipboard back to the training staff. He simply gave her another one of those subtle nods, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than any cheer. But the moment of stunned silence didn't last. The officer barked out something about statistical errors, about how maybe the markers hadn't been recorded properly, about how no outsider could outperform his men in their own domain. His voice was loud, but beneath it ran a current of defensiveness, a crack in his armor. Sarah kept her arms at her sides, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable. Arguing would be pointless. Skill didn't need her to defend it, the results already had. Still, the tension hung thick until the Master Chief cut through it with a growl. Run it again tomorrow. Same rules. No excuses. There was no room for debate in his tone, and even the officer had to swallow whatever protest was ready on his tongue. The circle broke, men dispersing in clusters of whispers and sidelong glances. Sarah walked alone toward the barracks set aside for visitors, her steps slow, measured, her mind replaying every strike, every takedown. She wasn't arrogant enough to think she couldn't fail. She knew how quickly fortune turned in combat. But tonight, she had done what they thought couldn't be done, and tomorrow she'd have to do it again under eyes sharper and more hostile than before. The barracks were quiet when she entered, dimly lit by a single lamp. She set her gear down, peeled off her damp shirt, and sank onto the narrow cot. Her muscles ached, but in the way that told her they performed at their peak. Sleep didn't come easy. She lay awake, listening to the hum of the air unit and the distant clang of equipment outside. Doubt had been their weapon against her, and while she had blunted it once, she knew they would sharpen it again come morning. They would watch her every move, ready to claim any slip as proof she didn't belong. Somewhere near midnight she heard a soft knock at the door. The Master Chief stepped inside, carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed one to her without a word, and she accepted it, twisting the cap with quiet gratitude. He sat on the edge of the bunk across from her, his weathered face unreadable in the low light. "You know what you did tonight," he said finally, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders. "But don't think for a second they'll let it stand. Tomorrow they'll push harder. They'll change the conditions, stack the odds, whatever it takes to make you stumble." Sarah took a slow sip of water, letting the cold bite settle her nerves. "Then I won't stumble." The chief's eyes studied her, searching for arrogance and finding none. Only resolve. He nodded once, then rose and left without another word. When dawn came, the compound was already alive with activity. The men moved with clipped precision, their whispers sharper now, their looks colder. Sarah laced her boots in silence, her hands steady even as the weight of the coming trial pressed down on her. She knew what was waiting, skepticism sharpened into hostility, a gauntlet designed to break her spirit if her body didn't first. At the morning briefing, the officer's voice rang louder than before, his words clipped and precise. "Last night was an anomaly," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the gathered men before landing squarely on her. "Tonight we'll settle it. Same raid, different parameters. Double the targets. Moving enemies. No repeats." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Even the operators who had mocked her before shifted uncomfortably, Doubling the targets meant doubling the risk, doubling the chaos. But the officer smiled thinly, relishing the stacked deck. Sarah didn't flinch. If anything, her spine straightened, her chin lifted. Let them shift the ground beneath her feet. She'd learned to fight on quicksand long before she ever set foot here. When night fell again, the compound went dark once more, the floodlights cut, the shadows deepened. But this time, Sarah wasn't walking into silence. The new targets moved, patrolling, their footsteps weaving a complex pattern of threat. The men surged into action, their radios crackling with clipped commands, their boots pounding the dirt. Sarah slipped into the dark again, her senses alive, her body a coiled spring. Every breath, every shift of fabric against stone painted the world in her mind. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was war on doubt itself, and she intended to win. The compound was alive with danger in every direction, the night vibrating with footsteps, whispers, and the metallic clink of weapons carried by the roaming sentries who served as tonight's moving targets. Sarah pressed herself against the cool stone of a wall, the faint vibration of boots on gravel telling her the patrol was less than 10 feet away. She waited, body still, breath slow, every muscle coiled like a predator ready to strike. The first patrolman stepped into view, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. In the faint moonlight, she caught the glint of his rifle. Timing was everything. As his head turned toward the opposite alley, she slipped forward, one fluid motion, hand locking over his mouth, arm pinning his weapon. A quick simulated strike and he was down. She dragged him silently into the dark, count one. No horn, no cheers, just the silent affirmation of another obstacle erased. Across the compound, gunfire erupted, shouts from the SEAL teams as they made contact. This wasn't the controlled chaos of the night before. This was full immersion, unpredictability layered over unpredictability. The officer's voice cut through the radios, barking instructions, urging his men forward with urgency. Sarah ignored it all. She moved like smoke, a shape half seen then gone, slipping from alley to doorway to shadow. Each corner brought new danger. A two-man patrol passed within arm's reach, their boots scuffing against stone as they whispered coded phrases. She waited for the rhythm of their steps, then moved in behind them, quick, silent, 2 neutralizations in the space of 3 heartbeats. The tally climbed. By the time she reached the northern sector, her count stood at 5. Sweat slicked her palms but her grip remained steady. Every sense was alive, every instinct sharpened. She heard a scuffle nearby, the sound of a SEAL team caught in crossfire. Shouts, the crack of simulated rounds, the grunt of exertion. She could have avoided it, continued her ghost's path, but she angled toward the fight instead. As she slipped through a gap in the wall, she saw them. 3 operators pinned behind cover, 2 targets advancing on their flank. The men were too focused on the shooters ahead to notice the danger closing in. Sarah acted before thought. She slid into the flank, taking the 2 advancing targets in quick succession, dropping them before they could spring the trap. The operators spun, startled, recognition flashing across their faces as they realized who had saved them. She didn't wait for thanks, didn't need acknowledgement. She melted back into shadow, her tally now 7. The fight dragged on, the night stretching endlessly as targets roamed, regrouped, adapted. Sarah adjusted with them, her movements unpredictable, her strategy fluid. She used every sound, every whisper of movement to track and ambush. At one point she found herself pinned, a target patrolling mere feet away while another lingered just beyond the corner. Her heart thudded in her chest, loud enough she was sure they'd hear. She waited, counting breaths, until the rhythm of their patrols fell just out of sync, creating a gap. She slipped between them, striking fast, vanishing before their bodies had even stilled. 9, 10. Her body ached, her lungs burned, but the fire in her chest pushed her forward. Somewhere in the compound, the officer's voice barked again, this time sharper, tinged with frustration. His men were fighting hard, taking down targets, but they were scattered, slowed, losing ground to the chaos. Sarah pressed on, each movement deliberate. By the time she reached the central courtyard, she had climbed to 13. The space was wide open, bathed faintly in moonlight, a killing ground for anyone foolish enough to cross it without cover. But the last 2 targets were there, their silhouettes shifting near the mock barracks. Sarah crouched in the shadows, calculating. A direct assault would expose her. Patience then. She waited, letting them move, listening for the subtle cues in their steps. When one peeled away, leaving a gap between them, she slid low across the courtyard, every step timed to the crunch of boots. She struck the first in silence, dragging him down before the second even realized his partner was gone. The last one spun, weapon raised, eyes scanning the dark. Sarah was already moving, cutting angles, closing distance. She hit him from behind, the fight brief but decisive. 15. Again. The horn blared, sharp and final, signaling the end of the exercise. The compound fell into silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of men emerging from shadows, sweat-soaked and exhausted. Sarah stepped into the open, her chest heaving, her shirt clinging to her skin. The tally was called again, and the numbers told the story with brutal simplicity. The SEAL teams had fought hard, their totals respectable, but none had cleared the board. Only one name carried 15. Again. The officer's face was pale with fury, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from stone. His men shifted uneasily, their earlier scoffs gone, replaced by something heavier, respect, or at least the beginnings of it. The Master Chief's voice cut through the tension like steel. No excuses. No errors. She did it. And in the silence that followed, Sarah didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just stood there, breathing hard, her body aching, her mind already steeling itself. Because she knew this wasn't over. The night after the second raid ended, the compound felt different. The air was heavier, the silence charged, the men no longer laughing at her presence. Sarah felt their eyes on her when she passed, a mix of disbelief, irritation, and a reluctant respect none of them wanted to voice. Twice now she had walked into their crucible and walked out with perfection, 15 for 15, while seasoned operators had fallen short. But respect in their world was never gifted, it was wrestled from clenched fists and guarded hearts, and she knew tomorrow would bring a new challenge designed to break her. The officer's pride had been cut too deeply to let the matter rest. That night, as she sat on her bunk, stripping and cleaning her gear even though it was only training equipment, she thought about what drove her. It wasn't glory. It wasn't even the satisfaction of proving someone wrong. It was survival, the kind etched into her bones from years of carving her path through hostile places where failure meant death. She remembered being 22, hauling a wounded civilian across 2 kilometers of burning desert under fire because there had been no one else to do it. She remembered the empty-eyed stares of mercenaries who underestimated her until the first bullet found their chest. Those memories weren't scars, they were steel, and they were why she never flinched when men like the SEAL officer laughed at her. The Master Chief found her again before dawn, his heavy steps echoing down the corridor. He didn't bother knocking this time. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes weighing her. "They're changing the game again," he said. His voice was flat, but she caught the undercurrent. They weren't just testing her anymore, they were trying to bury her. "What's the setup?" she asked, slipping her boots on. "Multi-phase," he said. "Not just neutralizations. Hostage extractions, intel retrieval, live opposition. They'll flood the compound with twice the targets again, but this time the objectives shift on the fly. It'll be chaos." Sarah nodded, not flinching at the weight of it. Chaos was nothing new. Chaos had been her teacher, her constant companion. "Good," she said simply, and the chief studied her for a moment before giving the smallest grunt of approval. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the compound fell under the blanket of night once more, the teams gathered. The officer stood tall, his expression carved into arrogance, but his eyes burned with frustration. "Tonight," he said loudly, "we'll see who really belongs here. No tricks. No outsider's luck. Real operations." His words were daggers aimed at her, but she didn't let them pierce. She only listened for the details. Moving hostages. Shifting intel markers. Targets adapting to their losses. A living, breathing battlefield. When the horn blared and the compound went black, Sarah didn't run with the others. She slipped alone into the darkness, her body already humming with the rhythm of the hunt. She knew what was waiting, layers of threats, traps designed to overwhelm, scenarios stacked against her. But she also knew herself. Her first breakthrough came in the southern sector, where 2 targets guarded a hostage bound in one of the storage sheds. She crept along the walls, her senses stretched to their limits. The muffled cough of the hostage gave away the position. Timing the patrols, she moved fast, neutralizing one with a choke before spinning into the second, her strike fluid and merciless. She freed the hostage, guiding him silently to the extraction point. One objective down. Across the compound, chaos raged. Gunfire rattled, men shouted orders, the officer's voice cutting harsh through comms. Teams were stumbling, trying to adapt to the shifting objectives, but their coordination was fraying under the pressure. Sarah thrived in the cracks. She moved from one sector to the next, ghosting past teams locked in firefights, sliding into spaces no one noticed. By the time she reached the mock command post, she had taken down 6 targets, secured another hostage, and retrieved a critical intel marker from under their noses. Her count wasn't just kills now, it was objectives, victories stacked where no one believed she could reach. In the northern courtyard, she nearly met her end. 3 targets patrolled in tight formation, their eyes sharper, their movements coordinated. She couldn't strike one without the others reacting. She crouched in the shadows, heart hammering, waiting for the sliver of opportunity. It came when gunfire erupted nearby, drawing their attention for a split second. She slipped behind, taking the first 2 in a blur of motion before grappling with the third in brutal silence. Sweat drenched her shirt, her muscles screamed, but when she dragged his body into the dark, she was still standing. 10. The horn didn't blow for another 20 minutes, 20 minutes of pure chaos where Sarah fought, slipped, adapted, and endured. By the end, she had secured all 3 hostages, retrieved the intel, and racked up 14 targets neutralized. Not 15 this time, but every objective completed flawlessly. When the horn finally sounded, the men staggered into the open, faces hard, bodies drained. The officer stepped forward, ready to tear her down for falling 1 target short. But the Master Chief spoke first, his voice ringing like a gavel. Objectives were the mission. She cleared them all. None of your men did. The yard fell into silence again, the truth undeniable. Sarah stood there, breathing hard, sweat-soaked, body trembling with exhaustion, but unbroken. Her eyes locked with the officers, and for the first time she saw it. Not mockery, not dismissal, but the smallest flicker of fear. The compound never truly slept, but the hours after the 3rd raid carried a strange quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Sarah sat alone on the steps outside the barracks, the night air cooling her sweat-soaked skin, the faint hum of generators breaking the silence. She rolled her shoulders, every muscle burning with fatigue, but it was the kind of pain she understood, the kind that told her she had gone beyond what they expected and still endured. Inside, she could hear the murmurs of men trying to make sense of her. Twice she had wiped the board clean, and on the 3rd trial she had executed every objective with precision none of them had matched. For some, disbelief still clung stubbornly, but for others, cracks had formed in their certainty. Cracks that looked like respect. But respect was a dangerous thing in this place, because it made the officer's fury burn hotter. She had humiliated him 3 nights in a row, and humiliation was poison to a man who thrived on dominance. When the morning came, she didn't have to wait long to see his retaliation. The briefing was short, his words clipped, his face locked in that mask of command. Tonight would not be another raid, he announced. Tonight would be survival. The compound had been reconfigured into a kill maze. Moving targets, shifting patrols, but no objectives, no hostages, no intel. Just endurance. The rule was simple. Last one standing won. The operators around her shifted, some smirking, some grimacing. Survival exercises were brutal, designed to strip men down to nothing and leave only instinct. They favored endurance, aggression, and raw willpower, and the officer believed those were weapons she didn't possess. Sarah listened quietly, absorbing every detail. She knew what this was. Not just a trial, but an attempt to break her in front of everyone, to make her fold under pressure until all her victories meant nothing. The sun dropped, the shadows stretched long, and when the horn sounded the compound dissolved into war. Men scattered into the dark, their movements sharp, their discipline evident. Simulated rounds cracked, shouts echoed, boots thundered across dirt and stone. Sarah didn't rush. She slid low, vanishing into the first alley, her senses sharpening into the familiar rhythm. Survival wasn't new to her. Survival had been her life long before she stepped into this compound. The first hour was chaos. Operators hunted each other as if the targets were real enemies, their radios a storm of clipped commands and heavy breathing. Sarah kept to the edges, ghosting through blind spots, striking when she had to, vanishing when she didn't. She neutralized 2 in silence, leaving their markers behind, then slipped deeper into the maze. By the 2nd hour, the compound had thinned. The voices on comms grew fewer, the gunfire more sporadic. Sweat ran down her spine, her lungs burned, her thighs ached from crouching and sprinting in quick bursts. But her mind was clear, focused. She knew the officer was somewhere out there, not just commanding but hunting, waiting for the moment to corner her. At one point she found herself face to face with a young operator, his rifle raised, his eyes wide with surprise. For a split second they froze, both calculating. Then he lunged, but she was faster, sliding under his arm, striking hard into his chest, taking him down in silence. 3. The horn never blew. The night stretched into a relentless grind, Every second heavier, every corner sharper. Men grew sloppy as exhaustion set in, their discipline cracking under the weight of survival. Sarah didn't falter. She slowed her breathing, measured her pace, and let her body run on instinct where others burned themselves out. By the third hour only a handful remained. She could hear them, the scuff of boots, the ragged breathing of men trying to push past their limits. Then came the voice, the officer's, not over comms but in the dark itself. "You think you belong here?" His words carried through the night like a challenge, a growl meant for her alone. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She kept moving, silent as the shadows that cloaked her. The officer wanted to rattle her, to draw her into a fight on his terms, but Sarah had learned long ago that survival wasn't about answering challenges. It was about choosing the ground you fought on. When he finally appeared, it was sudden, his frame filling the alley, rifle raised, eyes locked on her. For a moment the world shrank to the two of them, predator and prey, though neither was sure which was which. He advanced slowly, confidence radiating from every step. But Sarah didn't back away. She pivoted, slid sideways into the dark and vanished before his eyes. His curse echoed off the walls, sharp and furious. The horn blew at dawn, long and final. Survivors emerged, staggering, sweat-drenched, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Only 4 stood. Sarah was one of them. The officer, seething, was another. He didn't look at her as the numbers were read, but she saw the tightness in his jaw, the fury in his silence. He hadn't broken her. Not tonight. Not yet. Dawn broke over the compound with a bruised sky, the horizon painted in streaks of gray and pale orange, but the men didn't move with the relief that usually came with morning. They were heavy, silent, shoulders tense from the survival trial that had dragged them to the edge of collapse. Sarah sat on the edge of her cot, stripping her rifle piece by piece, cleaning each component with methodical care. Her body ached with a bone-deep fatigue, her joints stiff, her skin sticky with sweat that hadn't seemed to dry since the first raid. But her mind was calm, her breathing steady. She was still here. The officer, though, was a storm contained in a man's body. His silence wasn't peace, it was rage bottled tight, ready to explode. She saw it in the way his jaw flexed when their eyes met, in the way his men avoided standing too close to him. 3 times she had humiliated him outright, and in the 4th he had tried to drown her under endurance only to watch her emerge unbroken. For him, this had stopped being about proving anything. It had become personal, a battle not just of skill but of ego. At the briefing that evening, his voice carried the sharp edge of fury wrapped in command. "Tonight will be final," he declared, his eyes burning holes into her. "No simulations. No markers. Live fire." The words hit like a shockwave, sending ripples of unease through the ranks. Live fire meant no safety net, no controlled environment. Mistakes wouldn't be measured with tally marks, they would be measured with blood. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze shift toward her, some with doubt, some with fear, some with something harder to define. She didn't flinch, didn't let the officer see even a flicker of hesitation. Her only movement was the slight adjustment of her boots on the gravel, a grounding gesture she had used countless times before combat. When the sun fell, the compound transformed into something far more sinister. Shadows stretched across walls pocked with bullet marks, corners hid teeth instead of drills, and every sound carried the weight of lethal consequence. The horn blew and the world went dark, but this time the silence was jagged, broken by the reality of live weapons chambered and ready. Sarah slipped into the alleys, her body remembering the rhythm even as her pulse thundered in her ears. Every movement had to be perfect, every decision carved from instinct. She spotted the first enemy near the eastern gate, his outline betraying him against the faint light of the moon. Her hands steadied, her weapon rose, and the crack of the shot split the night. He dropped. The sound echoed, carried, and suddenly the compound erupted. Gunfire lit the dark in staccato bursts, muzzle flashes painting brief, violent pictures against the walls. Shouts echoed, sharp and urgent, the chaos of real combat swallowing the simulation they had all grown used to. Sarah moved low, flowing from shadow to shadow, each step chosen, each corner approached with lethal caution. She neutralized 2 more in quick succession, her movements fluid, efficient, deadly. Her count climbed, but tonight wasn't about numbers. Tonight was survival in its truest form. A firefight broke out near the central courtyard, the sound deafening as rounds snapped and ricocheted off stone. Sarah pressed against a wall, waiting, listening. She caught the rhythm of the shooters, the gap between bursts, and moved in that heartbeat of silence. When she emerged on the far side, 2 men lay on the ground, their weapons silenced by her hand. She kept moving, always moving, because stopping was death. The hours bled together, a blur of violence and silence, of the acrid sting of gunpowder and the metallic tang of adrenaline on her tongue. Her body screamed for rest, her lungs burned with every breath, but her focus never wavered. By the time the moon climbed high overhead, she had taken down 9. But she knew who was waiting for her. The officer wasn't just another enemy in the dark. He was the storm she had been walking toward since the first night. She found him near the northern wall, his shadow massive, his weapon steady, his stance radiating fury and command. For a moment, neither moved. The compound around them still roared with gunfire, but in that narrow corridor the world shrank to 2. He raised his weapon, the faint gleam of his eyes fixed on her, but Sarah didn't falter. She circled, low and precise, her body coiled, her breathing steady. He squeezed off a shot, the round sparking stone inches from her. She slid sideways, closing the distance. Another shot tore the night, but she was already moving, already closing, until suddenly they collided, rifles tangling, bodies slamming into the wall. It was no longer about weapons. It was raw will against will, strength against precision, fury against focus. He swung like a man trying to crush everything in his path, but she flowed around him, redirecting, countering, striking where he left openings. The fight was brutal, silent except for the sound of their breath and the scrape of boots on gravel. And when it ended, it was him on the ground, weapon torn from his hands, her knee pressing into his chest, her weapon leveled at his face. The silence that followed was heavier than any horn. She didn't speak, didn't gloat. She only held his gaze until the fury in his eyes cracked into something else. Recognition, unwilling respect, maybe even fear. Then she rose, leaving him on the ground as the last horn blew to mark the end of the final trial. The horn's echo still hung in the air when the men emerged from the shadows, weapons lowered, sweat dripping, breaths ragged. The exercise was over, but the silence that followed wasn't triumph. It was something heavier, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had just unfolded. Sarah stood tall in the open ground, her chest heaving, her body trembling with exhaustion but unbroken. Across from her, the officer pushed himself to his feet, dust and gravel clinging to his fatigues, his pride bleeding from the defeat he had just suffered. No words came from him, not at first, because words couldn't mask what everyone had seen. She had beaten him, not by chance, not by error, but in direct combat. The Master Chief's voice finally cut through the night. That's it. No more doubts. His tone was sharp, final, carrying the authority of a man who had seen too many battles to waste time on ego. She's earned it. Some of the men nodded subtly, their expressions guarded but no longer mocking. Others avoided her gaze, struggling to reconcile their world with the reality standing before them. But Sarah didn't wait for their approval. She walked past them, her steps slow, controlled, her weapon slung across her back, and vanished into the barracks without a word. Alone in her room, she stripped off her gear with deliberate slowness, every movement heavy with fatigue. Her body throbbed with bruises, her muscles screamed from the fight, but inside her chest burned a calm fire. She had come here unwanted, doubted, dismissed, and she had shattered every wall they built in front of her. But she also knew something else. The fight wasn't finished. Men like the officer didn't surrender. They schemed, they clawed, they rebuilt their pride on the bones of others. Sleep was shallow, fractured, haunted by echoes of gunfire and the flash of muzzle blasts in the dark. When morning came, she rose with the sun, her movements stiff but precise. She stepped outside into the yard, the compound already alive with drills, boots pounding, orders shouted. The officer stood near the edge, arms folded, his face a mask carved from stone. He didn't look at her, but she felt the weight of his fury pressing across the gravel between them. Later that day she was called to the operations room. Maps were spread across the tables, real maps this time, not simulations. Lines marked routes through hostile territory, pins marked compounds, and photographs showed faces etched with violence. The Master Chief gestured her closer. "We're rotating out in 72 hours, he said. "Real deployment. Real targets. You're coming." The words hit with the weight of steel. This wasn't a trial, not a test, not another simulation meant to humiliate or prove. This was war. Sarah met his eyes, searching for hesitation, but there was none. He wasn't offering her a favor. He was giving her a place she had already earned. Behind him, the officer stiffened, his jaw tightening at the declaration. His voice was cold when he finally spoke. "She doesn't belong in an operational theater. She's not one of us." The chief didn't even turn toward him. "She's coming," he said flatly. The officer's silence after that was sharper than his words. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Gear was checked, rechecked, weapons cleaned, comms tested. Sarah moved among the men with the same calm precision she had carried through every trial. Some began to speak to her now, short words, quiet questions, nods of acknowledgement that weren't yet friendship but no longer contempt. She didn't push. She didn't need their approval. She just needed their trust when the bullets started flying. On the eve of deployment, she found herself standing alone at the edge of the compound, staring out into the desert as the wind carried the smell of sand and dust. Thought about how far she had come, from the girl who had learned survival in places no one else wanted to remember, to the woman standing here, on the brink of war with men who had once laughed at her. She wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury she had lost long ago. That night, sleep came easier. It was the calm before the storm, the steady silence that always preceded combat. When dawn came, the trucks were waiting. Engines rumbled, dust rose, men climbed aboard with rifles slung and packs strapped tight. Sarah took her seat among them, the weight of her gear familiar, grounding. The officer sat across from her, his eyes cold, his face unreadable. For a long moment they stared at each other, unblinking, a silent war waged in the space between. Then the trucks rolled forward, carrying them into the horizon where training ended and reality waited with teeth bared. The desert swallowed the convoy as the trucks rumbled deeper into hostile territory, the sun dipping low until shadows stretched long across the barren earth. Sarah sat with her rifle resting against her knee, helmet tilted low, listening to the rhythm of the wheels grinding over sand and stone. Around her, the men sat in silence, each one locked in his own ritual of preparation. Some tapped magazines, some closed their eyes in wordless prayers, others simply clenched their fists until their knuckles turned pale. The officer sat across from her, arms folded, his glare steady, as if the battle ahead was less important than the one still burning inside him. The truck slowed then stopped. The air was heavy with heat and dust as boots hit the ground. Orders snapped through radios, maps were checked, weapons chambered. Ahead, through the dark haze of night, the compound loomed, an enemy stronghold tucked into the desert, guarded by men who would not hesitate to kill anyone who breached their walls. Sarah crouched low with the rest of the unit, heart hammering with anticipation, her body tuned like a drawn bow. The chief's voice whispered through comms, "Move." They advanced in silence, a line of shadows dissolving into deeper shadow. Sarah's senses sharpened, every sound amplified, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the faint click of a safety being disengaged, the distant bark of a dog within the compound walls. At the perimeter, a guard shifted, unaware of the death waiting in the dark. Sarah raised her rifle, breath steady, and fired. The shot was clean, silent, final. The guard crumpled and they slipped inside like ghosts. The raid unfolded with brutal precision. Explosions thundered in the distance as breaching charges blew doors open, gunfire erupted in sharp bursts, shouts in foreign tongues tore through the night. Sarah moved with the team, low and fast, sweeping corners, clearing rooms, her rifle an extension of her body. Each decision was instinct, each movement carved from the discipline of survival. She dropped 2 enemies near a stairwell, another as he reached for a radio, and a fourth as he stumbled from a side room with panic in his eyes. The chaos didn't touch her focus, it only sharpened it. The officer, she noticed, fought like a man possessed, his rage pouring into every shot, every strike. But rage made him reckless, and more than once she saw him falter, saw him leave his flank exposed, saw him rush when patience was required. Twice, she covered him without thinking, her shots saving him before he even realized the danger. She never looked for acknowledgement. She only moved forward. The deeper they pressed, the more the resistance grew. Enemy fighters poured through corridors, rifles spitting fire, grenades rattling against concrete. The compound became a furnace of violence, the air thick with smoke, screams, and the metallic stench of blood. But Sarah didn't waver. Her count climbed, 7, 8, 9, 10, each one a shadow erased from the battlefield. Then came the courtyard, wide and open, a killing ground with enemies dug in behind cover. The team hesitated, pinned by the wall of fire. The officer barked orders, his voice sharp, but his plan faltered against the reality of bullets tearing the air. It was Sarah who moved first. She darted along the edge, rolling low, slipping into the shadows of collapsed stone. Her rifle barked 3 times, each shot precise, each target falling before they could react. The others seized the moment, advancing behind her momentum, and soon the courtyard belonged to them. But the fight wasn't finished. A roar split the night as a reinforced squad surged from the far barracks, heavier weapons bristling. For a heartbeat, the team wavered, the weight of the onslaught threatening to crush them. Sarah felt it too, the tide threatening to turn, the mission slipping toward failure. And then instinct took over. She broke from cover, sprinting through the hail of gunfire, diving into the flank of the advancing squad. She became a phantom in the chaos, striking fast, vanishing into shadow, her rifle cracking like thunder in the night. 1, 2, 3 more fell. A grenade clattered near her feet. She kicked it back before it could detonate, the explosion ripping through the enemy line instead. She didn't stop. She couldn't. 15. That was the number when silence finally returned, broken only by the crackle of flames licking at ruined walls and the ragged breaths of survivors. 15 enemies she had taken in the dark, each one a thread in the tapestry of survival that had defined her since the beginning. The courtyard was theirs, the compound theirs, the mission complete. The officer stood among the wreckage, his chest heaving, his face pale with the weight of what he had seen. He met her eyes across the battlefield, and for the first time, there was no fury in his stare. Only silence, heavy and raw, the silence of a man who had been forced to see truth laid bare. The chief's voice came over comms, firm and steady, objective secured. All units, hold position. Sarah lowered her rifle, her body trembling with exhaustion, her hands streaked with dirt and blood. She stood in the center of the courtyard, the night wind cooling her sweat, the stars blazing above her. She had been barred, mocked, dismissed, but in the fire of combat she had proven herself beyond question. She didn't need applause, didn't need words. The battlefield itself was the only witness she required, and it had spoken. The end.